Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello everyone, welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and joining me today is Roy Stemman, and he's, and that might be Stemman, and I may be pronouncing it wrong, and if I am, I apologize. And he's got a book out called The Big Book of Reincarnation. I've read this book personally, and it is chock full of information about reincarnation from many different perspectives, and some of them I don't think many of the researchers have thought about, much less investigated as well as he has. And some of the actual past life experiencers that he's actually been in contact with have had some very interesting cases. Pardon that little bit of a cough there, folks. I'll try not to do that on the air, but, you know, down here we've been having a lot of rain, and all the moisture in the air kind of gets in your throat and gets you kind of crouped up. So if I do slip in here and there, just kind of overlook me. Roy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Royce. Thank you very much.
Okay. Real quick, before we get involved in this, I want to tell everybody they can learn more about you and your book at www.paranormalreview.com. If y'all have any questions, you can call in at, I lost my number. It's right here on the page in front. Here it is. I had to scroll up, not down. The number to call in is 832-632-7904. If you're listening at YouTube or somewhere else, to join the show live, get into chat. The membership here is free. It's www.paranormalpalace.com. Pardon me. Roy, real quick, why don't you tell everybody here, just kind of break the ice and help them know you a little bit better, what got you involved in reincarnation in particular?
Well, that goes back to my teenage years. I first became interested in the big question, what happens when we die? For the reason that I came across a book by Air Chief Marshal Lord Dowding, who was the person who led the Battle of Britain during World War II for Britain, and he's a British hero, understandably. And I was very surprised to read in the book that during the Second World War, he, as well as playing the role that he did, he was also attending seances and receiving messages from dead soldiers and airmen and passing them on to family members. They were actually giving him contact details of where they could find their loved ones, and he passed them on. So that opened my mind to the possibility of communication with the dead, and I became subsequently very involved in the spiritualist movement and wrote for a spiritualist newspaper called Psychic News for 8 years and became assistant editor of the newspaper. But one of the things that always puzzled me about spiritualism's belief about the afterlife was a contradiction relating to reincarnation. Some mediums and their spirit guides believed very much in reincarnation, and others dismissed it as impossible and argued that our spiritual development after this life was always to be found in other dimensions, in an afterlife, if you like. And I was really puzzled as to why they couldn't agree, even the spirits communicating couldn't agree about reincarnation. And I always liked a good mystery and a good challenge, and I decided to try and come up with the answers myself by looking at the evidence. After all, belief in something is fine, but if it's not based on evidence, then sometimes you're on shaky ground. So that's how I began collecting evidence, exploring the subject, reading up about it, meeting the researchers, and ultimately I did a TV documentary which took me to the Lebanon and the Druze community, where I met many individuals who could remember past lives, and I've also met people remembering past lives in the United States and in the UK and in other parts of Europe. So putting it all together, I came to the conclusion that the evidence for reincarnation is very strong, and I put that evidence in the book, but I've also dealt with the alternative theories and explanations that we also have to examine very closely before we come to any firm opinion on this.
Matter of fact, didn't you devote a chapter, entire chapter to the alternatives?
Yes, I did. Absolutely. And in fact, any researcher working in this field, first of all, when they come across a case, it's the alternative theories they need to address first, and they do. And the alternative theories include fraud, particularly in some of the underdeveloped countries. One could argue that some very poor families have encouraged their children to remember a past life of having lived with a wealthy family, for example, in the hopes that by having a reunion, if you like, or an introduction to that family, and convincing them that their child is the reincarnation of somebody important in that wealthy family, that they might benefit financially, obviously. There's very little evidence that ever happens, but it's something one has to examine and dismiss or accept depending on the evidence for it. Other possibilities are simply that a child has obtained that information from other sources, overhearing things, etc. So all these alternative explanations have to be looked at, and only when they have all been discarded are we ready to entertain the thought that these individuals really are remembering a life they have lived previously on Earth.
Okay. And I think it's good that you do that. I have a lot more confidence when I read an author's book and they've given you the whole picture and both sides, because there's an author that's giving you a big picture to look at. They're not just saying, look at my belief. In other words, look at my agenda. Anybody could do that, and there are some who do. So when somebody does like you do, I'm like, well, I got more confidence in this person. You see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Well, I have no vested interest in making people believe in reincarnation. In fact, occasionally people say to me, oh, you just like the idea of reincarnation because it's an attractive idea, etc. And I always counter that with the statement, well, actually, I don't think it's a very attractive idea. I'm not sure that I would want to reincarnate. Maybe I'll come back in my next life in a situation that is not one that I really appreciate. I mean, I'm really enjoying my life now, and it's been a great life so far, and I hope it's got plenty more things, to look forward to. But if we accept reincarnation as being something that happens to us all on a regular basis, then we've got to accept the possibility that part of the reason for reincarnating is to expand our experience or give us more experiences, and that must include good and bad experiences. So it's not necessarily an attractive belief, but all I'm saying in my book is that here are some really strong cases. Take a look at them. Decide for yourself whether you think this evidence is proof of reincarnation, and if so, draw your own the implications from that.
Right.
But I'm not saying that I believe that everybody reincarnates. All I'm saying is that the very good cases I'm presenting appear to be proof, and maybe that indicates we do all reincarnate.
Okay. Now, one of the things that you made a distinction about in your book that I thought would be a good idea to clarify for all the listeners here is the distinction between rebirth and reincarnation. Can you elaborate on that for the listeners?
Well, that's more, in the Hindu religion, they do make a distinction, but I must say that for most people in the West, the terms are interchangeable, and I confess that I use rebirth sometimes instead of reincarnation because it's a shorter word. But I think in the Hindu religion they talk of rebirth for humans, but reincarnation for gods. Or it may be the other way around, but that's their distinction. But to me, there's not. It means much the same. It means whichever term you use, it means returning to earth and being born again. Except with Hindus, they're talking about gods and therefore not being born on earth, but being reborn as gods.
Okay. I can see why they would make that distinction. Now, for the purposes of this show, because when I type these questions, I put down like ever endorsed reincarnation or rebirth. I think it's easier just to say reincarnation, which is what I'm used to, so I won't be using both like I typed it on the question sheet here I made up. But one of the things I was going to ask you, and I kind of briefly touched with this on the telephone while we was waiting for the show to start, and I really only have that I can see, unless they're further down and I haven't scrolled to them yet, maybe three questions along this here vein, and none of them deal with at least what I would call too much speculation. And I just thought if you could give me as brief an answer, or as well the kind of answer you're able to give, because I realize there may be limitations here. I'd appreciate it. Did any of the three Abrahamic faiths believe in reincarnation, to your knowledge?
The answer to that is that Judaism, aspects of it do believe in reincarnation. In fact, I've had an interesting chat with a Rabbi Gershom, who did a lot of research with cases of people that claim to remember having been Jews during the period of the Holocaust, but had been reborn outside of the Jewish religion, and they attributed that to the fact that they were so horrified at the treatment they had as Jews that they just wanted to return to earth in a different culture and with a different appearance, so that they didn't experience that again. He wrote a book called Beyond the Ashes, which is a fascinating book. And for his particular aspect of Judaism, reincarnation is a very, very important teaching. The Kabbalah teachings are also very much in favor of reincarnation, but others are not so. So the answer is, as happens with lots of religions, there are offshoots. In fact, I mentioned earlier the Druze that I'd been to visit with a TV team to do a documentary. Reincarnation is so important to them, and yet they are an offshoot of Islam, and Islam does not teach reincarnation. So when you begin to examine religious belief and the differences in views over the centuries, it's quite fascinating to see how religions evolve and change their views of the afterlife and what may happen to us. And there's even an argument that the early Christians believed very strongly in reincarnation, but it was made anathema, which was wiped out of their beliefs at a meeting in Constantinople, and it's all in my book about how that happened. And so the Christian teachings no longer talk about reincarnation or rebirth. And yet, interestingly, if you look at current opinion polls in the West, both in the United States and the United Kingdom, you'll find that something like 20% of Christians who are asked whether they believe in reincarnation or not will give a positive answer, either that they accept it totally or that they are open to the possibility. So even what's happening these days is that religious beliefs are getting quite mixed up, and people are making up their own minds about these important subjects and not being too rigid in their outlook just because of the teachings of the church that they belong to.
Right. Well, you kind of sort of answered my next question, because I was going to ask, what evidence have you found, if any, that Christianity ever endorsed reincarnation? And I think I just heard you cover that with the early church and it being wiped out at Constantinople. However, the next question behind that, and that's the last one that deals with religion, is a little bit more specific, because I know that many of the early Christian sects like Gnosticism, Catholicism, and, some of the others of the day, in other words, did in fact teach reincarnation, and it was a part of their doctrine. However, more specifically, and I'm not sure, but I'm kind of thinking your answer about Constantinople, since that was really held for the Catholic Church. You're saying that your book is covering that the Catholic Church itself, at one point, in its very early roots, did have a doctrine on reincarnation, and at Constantinople removed it from the Catholic Church as well?
I don't say specifically the Catholic Church. It goes back to AD 185, so it's very early days in Christianity. There was a Christian writer and theologian called Origen, and he wrote, and I'll do a quote, he wrote, "The soul, which is immaterial and invisible in its nature, exists in no material place without having a body suited to the nature of that place. Accordingly, it at one time puts off one body, which is necessary before, but which is no longer adequate in its changed state, and it exchanges it for a second." So that is very clearly a belief by this very important early Christian writer, that's what happened. The soul went from one life to another. But that was decided, that was the quote, and his teaching was chosen as being anathema. And what was declared to be anathema was that the pre-existence of a soul. So it wasn't actually saying reincarnation is not possible, but it was saying that at the moment you are born on earth, that's your first moment of life as a soul, and you couldn't have existed before. Whereas Origen was saying that you kept going over and over and over. So, it's a fascinating dispute as to when the soul begins, whether this is our first life or the first, we've had many before. But it's very clear from that and from other statements by other early Christians. Justin Martyr was another one that I quote, who was also living at about the same time as Origen. So we're talking only 100 or so, 200 years after the death of Jesus Christ. That was a widely held belief, and one would assume it was based on Jesus' teachings. But, at some point the church began, or the leaders of the church as it grew, began to get a bit more, have their own views, I think.
Right.
This is the problem with religion, I think. We often base our views and beliefs on what is written, but when you begin examining the written record, you come to the conclusion in many cases that it's been altered many times over the centuries. So my own view, as I indicated when we had our early discussion, is that it's rather than get too involved in what people believe, I tried to address in the book the evidence, which has nothing to do with belief, but it's factual. It's what is happening here and now.
Right.
And people have to make up their own minds on that, not because they've been taught what is possible and what isn't.
and I didn't really want to get off into the per se belief end of it, but I knew that there had been some actual factual documented stuff like you were talking about by Oregon and some of the other church fathers that I thought it might be helpful to, bring to light on the subject, in other words. Because you could get trapped off, like you saying, he said, she said, you're right, yeah, I'm right, in a hurry over the beliefs. And I've seen that happen in groups, and they turn into flame wars, and they're not very pleasant. But I think I really did enjoy your answer on that one a lot more than what you might expect, because one of the things that you did point out in that was the fact that the early church was, refuting the fact that you had another life before the one you're born into now.
Yeah.
Because God said in the Old Testament, Esau have I hated before he was born.
Mm-hmm.
If that was his first start, how could he have hated him before he was born, in other words? So I thought it brought out a very interesting point.
Sure.
But one of the things I wanted to ask you about real quick, like Oregon, was he, what was his position for the early Catholic Church? Because I want to say he was a bishop, wasn't he? Or was he?
All that I know about him is that he was a writer and a theologian.
Okay.
And I think that was even before Christianity was so far advanced that it had bishops. I'm only guessing.
Okay.
But no, he was a philosopher basically. In Constantinople, when his views were dismissed, they were in fact cursed, which is what the expression anathemized means. That took place. It was the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and that took place in AD 553. So we're talking.
So the church had been around 200 years when it happened.
Exactly. And so, that was 3 centuries after, or more, that Origen made these comments. But they'd carried over for those 3 centuries, and it wasn't until AD 553 that the followers of Christ were told that they could no longer adopt those views, and they had to focus on different interpretations of an afterlife.
Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense, and that was also very educational. I really appreciate you bearing with me through that there little segment that I know you mentioned earlier you really want to stay away from. I hope I made it, as, pleasant as possible to get through.
Yeah, well, I don't pretend to be an expert on any of the religions, but I do know of their interest, those that have an interest in reincarnation, so I can go that deep into them, but not much further.
Well, I understand that. And, it's I just really appreciate the fact that you come out and openly say that, because it shows people that you're more than willing to say, well, this I don't know, this I could be wrong about, because so many people aren't even willing to do that.
Oh, I say that too often, I think.
I know, I try to say it as often as I can, or at least as often as I can think about it.
Yeah.
And it apply. But another thing you mentioned in your book that got my attention, and this is something I'd never heard about until your book, was far memory. Can you elaborate on far memory and how it works?
Yes. I think the expression was developed by, or first used by, a British writer called Joan Grant. And she wrote a couple of books in the 1930s about life in Egypt. Now, these books were novels, apparently, and they were praised. They were bestsellers, and they were praised by the detail and the color of them. They were jolly good books to read. Winged Pharaoh was one of those books. And after they were successful, Joan Grant admitted that they were not a novel as such, but they were autobiographical, and they were based on her memories of a past life in Egypt. And she described the memories that she had as far memories, meaning they were memories far back in time, if you like. And she wrote a series of books relating to different lives that she could remember. And she, in fact, she dictated them to her first husband. It was rather an incredible story that she would say she was ready to tune into the far memory. She would almost go into a semi-trance, and she would start just dictating the story. And he would write it all down, and they collected it all together, but often it didn't flow or make sense. And it was only when the book was completed, or she said, now I finished telling that story, and they began to look at it, they found that she wasn't dictating the chapters consecutively. Sometimes she might have dictated chapter 3, and then chapter 10, and then chapter 1, but they managed to piece them all together, and they ended up with a complete story in chronological order, and a jolly good read it was as well. So that's the story of Joan Grant, and she was quite a remarkable man. And her third husband was a very talented psychotherapist, and she worked closely with him using her far memory to give readings for people and help people by telling them about their past lives. But that's another story. But that's where far memory, the expression, came from.
So what happens in cases where people have this far memory and it helps them to remember their past life, but yet they somehow lose it, like your book says, as they approach adolescence? Where does the memory go? What do you say? Because it seems to be a common recurring theme. Why do people lose this as they get older?
Well, I have to say that Joan Grant was an exception in that, as far as I know, the far memory she had was with her from childhood, but she did seem to need to go into a semi-trance to be able to bring back all the detail of her past life, but it seemed to be with her right through her life. Whereas the cases that I think are really important, and I make this distinction in the book, are spontaneous cases, and the distinction is between spontaneous cases and cases remembered under hypnosis. So the spontaneous cases we're talking about are of children who, almost from the moment they can speak, will start telling their parents of a previous life that they lived. They will be able to name names. They might say, I had a wife or a husband, his name was, we had 3 children, and name the children. We lived in this village or that village. My work involved doing this, etc. Enough detail for that life to be checked. Now, in many of these cases, that memory, as I say, begins around about the age of 3 or 4, and by the time they get to 8 years old, usually, or 9, the memory begins to fade. And the big question is why, as you just expressed it, why does that happen? I think the answer has to be, if we accept these as actual memories of a past life, that the child has been born with those memories, they are very vivid, they produce very strong emotions in the child to the extent of them wanting to run away and find that past life home and their past life parents. They can relate more to the past life that they can remember than to the new family in which they are born. But as they grow up, then things happen in their life, and I think it's understandable that the memory of that past life fades until they get to, say, 6, 7, or 8, and generally they can no longer remember very clearly. They might remember what they remembered, if you see what I mean. They can remember talking about it, but they don't have any immediate access to that past life memory anymore. So that's what normally happens, whereas with hypnosis, it's the opposite, really, that an adult who has no memories at all from birth of a past life will be hypnotized and taken back and asked to go beyond the point of their birth in this life, and will suddenly start describing a past life that they can recall under hypnosis in great detail. Now, some of these cases are fascinating, but I treat hypnotic regression cases with a great deal more caution than I do the spontaneous cases involving young children. And for the simple reason, if you look at the children, they are giving details of things that they have not been exposed to. They're talking about sometimes villages that they name that even their parents have never heard of, but they find that it exists. The child is taken to the village and they inquire and they find, sometimes the child will say, I will take you to my home, and will take them to a house in that village that none of the family has ever been to. And when they inquire at the house, they either find the family that the child remembered, or they find that the family no longer lives there, but there was a family with the names that the child is given. Now, skeptics need to come up with a very good alternative explanation there, and so far I've not seen any really convincing explanation. Whereas with hypnotic regression cases and adults, we've got to face the fact that an adult having a hypnotic regression will have absorbed in all the years up until that point an enormous amount of information from films, movies, television, documentaries, books, magazine articles, etc., that the subconscious mind, the memories have absorbed. Consciously, they might have forgotten a lot of that, but under hypnosis it can come out and the mind can dress it up as being a past life memory. So we do need to be a lot more cautious about regression cases. And in fact, on my blog that you mentioned earlier, paranormalreview.com, I just wrote a piece the other day about 3 different women, all of whom claimed to remember being Marilyn Monroe under hypnotic regression. And that sort of demonstrates the problem we're up against. You know, perhaps one of them is Marilyn Monroe and the other 2 are not. Maybe none of them are Marilyn Monroe. It's very difficult to determine.
Okay. And I know that some people would say, and I personally don't think it'd be possible to do this, but I'm going to run it by you since you deal with it all the time. Is there any cases in some of these really young 3-4-year-old children that the parents taught them this information before bringing them to, see you or someone or whoever's doing the therapy or the, getting the information?
What normally happens in these cases is that the family itself goes off to find confirmation if they are open to the possibility. And so in places like India and Sri Lanka, where the families are either Buddhist or Hindu and reincarnation is accepted, they are probably quite open to the possibility. But we also have to face the fact that many of the families are quite worried about, even if the child is remembering a past life accurately, they're quite worried about introducing that child to the past life family for fear of losing the child, that the past life family will claim him or her as their own. And in fact, there are some fascinating cases, and there are a couple in my book, where having met the past life family, both present life and past life families agreed to share the child for a period of time. The child might spend a few months with one and then come back home, or even 6 months and then come back for 6 months. I'm not sure what that does to the child's psychology, but certainly at an early age it seems to satisfy the child's need to re-identify with that past life family. But it seems that as he or she matures, he comes to terms with the fact that he's in a new body, experiencing a new life, and he has to let go, if you like. And I can give you some actual case study examples of that. But the reason I say all this is because by the time a researcher hears about one of these cases, it's often the introductions between the two families have already taken place. And it's very difficult for the researcher to separate what dialogue might have gone on between the two families and how accurate their memories are of what was said, and how much the child overhears and maybe then repeats, and they think it's new evidence. I mean, it is a quite complex thing. Professor Ian Stevenson, who was a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia, investigated cases of suggestive of reincarnation for 40 years. He amassed case studies, I think nearly 3,000 of them, and he always made the point that finding a perfect case has been almost impossible to do. But there have been one or two cases where a researcher has got to a family and a child before they've gone and met the past life family and been able to go with them and, observe what happens. So, and there's a case like that in the book as well. But the aim is always to try and get a perfect case that satisfies all the critics, and that's very difficult to come by.
Oh, yeah, I know. Critics can be something else. It's just like next to impossible to give them something that would, work, in other words. Not long ago, I had Bruce C. Leininger, and I might be pronouncing his last name wrong, but his son, as you know, because you mentioned him in your book.
Yep.
James, I believe it was.
James, indeed, yes.
Had a past life memory, and they got a book out called Soul Survivor.
Mm-hmm.
Now, would he be one of these cases that you would say, in your opinion, is one of the better cases?
Yes. Although the majority of cases seem to come from the Far East, in fact, there are a lot of very good cases from Europe and other parts of the world, not just the Far East. And James's case is pretty typical. It was he had nightmares remembering something that has happened to him, and I think his parents thought it was just a bad dream. But eventually he began pointing at pictures and of aeroplanes and other things, and the memories came out to the point where they were able to identify who he was in a past life. Interestingly, there are a couple of cases that I've written about which are similar in some respects, and one of them involved an English pilot who emigrated to the... he's an Englishman who remembered being an English pilot who emigrated to Australia, but he was shot down in World War II, and he was able to trace the pilot, the co-pilot that he was shot down with. That's one case, and there's another one of an English a boy who could remember being a German pilot who crashed in England, and the body was recovered. And one of the most fascinating is the cases in Burma, or Myanmar as we now are supposed to call it, where a couple of children were born who remembered being Japanese pilots. And that's an extraordinary case. It was investigated by Professor Ian Stevenson because in Burma, the Japanese overran Burma during the Second World War. They were not welcome, of course, and for a Burmese couple to have a newborn child who, once the child could speak, could remember being a Japanese soldier, it was not a welcome addition to the family, quite honestly. And particularly when the child is a girl, but remembers being a Japanese man and wants to dress in Japanese clothes and to fight, with swords and other things, but this is what happens in some reincarnation cases, that the child's memories are so strong at an early age, and for parents, coping with that is often very difficult. But the good news is that they eventually do, by and large, grow out of it.
Right. Now, here's something that you mentioned in your book that, well, when I read this, I personally thought that it had to be one of the stronger factors as far as regarding to showing reincarnation to be a, high possibility, and that was xenoglossy. Because if a person can, at an early age, quote a language that they knew in a, past life, there's only so many explanations. But I thought I'd let you tell everybody about xenoglossy.
I missed the name there, Roy, sorry.
Xenoglossy. Can you tell us about xenoglossy?
No. Because okay. I'm not getting the name as...
No, it's not a person's name.
Oh, sorry. It's xenoglossy.
Xenoglossy. Okay, I'm mispronouncing it. That's why we had a communication gap.
It is indeed. Xenoglossy it's often a term used for speaking in tongues, but it's actually something very different. Speaking in tongues is often a religious phenomenon where there was something called the Toronto Blessing, if I remember rightly, where people attending a church service, an evangelical church service, would suddenly appear to go into trance and start talking a foreign language, but nobody knew what was being said. And it's never been identified as anything. It's what sounds to us like gobbledygook. That's not to put it down, but it's pretty meaningless. Now, on the other hand, there are cases of reincarnation where xenoglossy is a feature of a person remembering a past life and being able to remember words from the language that they spoke in that life. Now, the problem with most of these cases is that they are not fluent. And what we're really looking for in a good case of reincarnation from one culture to another and one language to another is responsive xenoglossy. And that is where somebody that speaks that language can put questions to the individual in that language and get answers in that language. And the closest case I've come to is another that was investigated by Professor Stevenson, and it was an American woman who could remember a life as a German woman, and although she couldn't speak fluent German, she was able to respond responsively to some questions. Again, it wouldn't satisfy most skeptics, I'm afraid, who would expect nothing short of fluency to say, yes, that's it. But even then, they would argue that she probably had secret lessons in the language. One of the interesting ones in my book, which poses lots and lots of questions, is a case of a woman in India called Sharada, who suddenly woke up one day and seemed to be someone completely different. So she hadn't died. She had just somehow, in the night, her soul had gone, and then another soul had taken her place and gave details of who she was, but she had died decades before. But she could speak a language that Sharada couldn't speak. It was a dialect, and she spoke enough of that for people to check it out. But when they checked it out, it was actually an old form of that dialect. It wasn't the modern version. So it was a fascinating case, and it's one of those cases that would appear not to be reincarnation, but somehow possession, or spirit possession. Very rare, but that seems to be the only explanation. And possession by spirits has to be one of the alternative explanations that we look at in all cases of reincarnation.
And, one of the things I would look at here is that in cases of reincarnation versus possession is you'd be able to make a distinction between the two, wouldn't you?
You would think so. First of all, the person suddenly doesn't get taken over. So all the cases of children that I've talked about remembering a past life, they are still the child that has been born, but they just happen to have brought with them memories of a past life. Whereas in this case I just mentioned, it was a complete exchange of personality, if you like, and she was somebody completely different. So that's the distinction. And she had no. She actually is for her it was apparently a frightening experience, because she suddenly found herself in a different environment where people spoke a different language, and she had a husband she didn't recognize and 2 children she didn't recognize. But she soldiered on and eventually lived for many, many years in that family group. But she apparently wrote letters to her past life family once it was identified who she claimed she was. There was even talk, I think she was taken on one visit to that family, or the relatives of that family, and she wrote a letter saying that she didn't like where she is now. God had put her there and she didn't know why, and she would prefer to be back where she had begun. So it's a quite remarkable story, but very rare, very, very unusual for that to happen.
It sounds like it'd be pretty rare. Now, one of the things I was going to ask you about, and this is one of the cases you had in your book that I thought was, a really good case, at least it seemed to me like, and that was theyve.
Yeah, that's one of those from the Druze community, and he was a little boy who, at a very early age, he lived in a village called Asfiya in northern Israel, and he told his parents at a very early age that his real name was Ali. Let me remember this. Badawi, Ali Badawi, and he was a truck driver. He'd been a truck driver, and he said he'd been shot. As Druze, they were quite open to this possibility, but he said he'd lived in Lebanon. They lived in Israel. They had no way of checking it. They just accepted it, and as far as they were concerned, he was now their little boy, and he would grow up, and in time he'd forget those memories. But one day he was playing in the street when he saw a woman, and he went up to her and he said, "You're Nabiya, my wife." Now this woman was visiting Asfiya, I believe for the first time. She was a Lebanese woman, and she was visiting northern Israel, I don't know why, and her name was Nabiya. And when the little boy said to her, "I am Ali Badawi," she was absolutely astonished, because that was her dead husband's name. So she went back with him to his home, met his family, confirmed that he had identified her in the street as his wife, and was clearly very moved by meeting apparently the reincarnation of her dead husband, and stayed in touch with the family. Now, I think the little boy was about 5 years old at that time, but when he got to the age of 13, she invited him and his family to visit her in Baalbek, which in Lebanon, to come to the house in which he had lived when he was Ali Badawi. So he went there. So they remained in touch over the years. He went there. When he got to the door, he called for his daughter Lena, who I think was only a few years old when he had been murdered, and he also went into the house, saw his clothes hanging up, and his wife had not touched them since the day he died, and he even was able to say what he'd left in the pockets. And sure enough, when they searched, he called them my little treasures. I think they were cigarettes and a few other things, and they were exactly as he remembered, and they were in the pockets of his suit. And the really interesting thing about this case is that in the Jewish community, these sort of memories between families lead to these very complicated and intricate relationships. And because he was so accepted into the family as the dead father or husband, when Lena got married a couple of years later, little Ais was invited back to Baalbek, and he gave her away, because as far as the family were concerned, he was Lena's father, and he should be there to give her away, even though he was, 13, 14 years younger than the person he was giving away as his daughter. So it's a lovely story, and it shows that whatever skeptics and others say about these cases and the value of the evidence, for many people who experience reincarnation memories, it plays such an important part in their lives. In fact, it shapes their lives in many ways, and is often very rewarding as well.
Okay. Now, once again, I want to remind people that are listening at other locations other than my website, the phone number to call in is 832-632-7904. If you want to learn more about the guest, you can go to his website, www.paranormalreview.com. If you're here at my site, you can scroll down and you'll see his book cover and his picture right there, and a description of him and his book, both. And underneath that, you'll see a link to his book at Amazon. Feel free to click it, go over there and purchase the book from Amazon. I believe he's also got links on his website to the book as well, for those of you interested in obtaining a copy of it. And you can also get it at any major bookseller like Barnes & Noble, Amazon. I want to say Walden, but I'm not sure. They're not exactly as big as Barnes & Noble or Amazon. Now, I was going to mention to you, Roy, that we've been on here for almost an hour now. Would you need to take a break for anything, or would you like to continue on, or how do you want to do this?
I'm absolutely fine. I can carry on happily.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I, thought to ask you that before we got too far into this, because I have a tendency of getting carried away in the conversation and forgetting where I'm at.
No problem.
Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, have you heard of any evidence that past lives affect present life behaviors?
Most definitely. In fact, behavior is often the first clue for some families that there is a past life influence. And this behavior can take different forms. So in some of the cases, particularly where the memories are very strong in young children, and again, the majority of these cases are to be found in the Far East, the child will complain about the food he's being given or the clothes he's having to wear, and insists that he had much better grub put before him in a past life, or that she had much nicer clothes to wear, or that they had a car in a previous life and he was driven around everywhere and now he has to walk everywhere. Having a child with strong memories of past life is clearly not easy for parents, but so that sort of behavior is often an indicator, quite even before they might be able to give details of the past life. Another indicator, though, are fears and phobias. And here, often the memories are not strong enough to provide any corroboratory information. And Carol Bowman, an American mother who has written a couple of books about this, she first became aware of the importance of phobias with her own children. She had a son called Chase, who, when he was a very young boy, he was going to be taken out to see a fireworks display. I'm not sure what the event was, but it was something he was really looking forward to. And I think he was only 4 or 5 years old. When they got outside to see the fireworks and the first explosions happened, instead of being excited, he suddenly became really fearful and cried so much that his mother had to take him home and placate him and quieten him down. But she couldn't understand what the problem was. And eventually he was okay and he went to sleep, and that was sort of forgotten. But she talked to it about it to a therapist who was a friend of the family. And he encouraged her to just get Chase to sit on her knee at some time when he was quiet, and just to close his eyes and just to ask him to say what it was he saw or felt in his mind when he heard those explosions. And sure enough, he did that. And to her astonishment, he began describing a scene where he was in what appeared to be a civil war setting, and he described being surrounded by other soldiers, and they were shooting and killing people. He said he had a gun with a sword on the end, which was presumably a description of a rifle with a bayonet. And basically, he said, I'm standing behind a rock. I'm carrying a long gun with a kind of sword at the end. And his mother asked him, what are you wearing? He said, I have dirty, ripped clothes, brown boots, a belt. I'm hiding behind a rock, crouching on my knees and shooting at the enemy. I'm at the edge of a valley. The battle is going on all around me. And the upshot of this was that he said, I don't want to look. She asked him a few more questions, and he said, I don't want to look. I'm scared. I shoot at anything that moves. I really don't want to be here and shoot other people. And she said, that's all right. And she quietened him down, and that was the end of the experience. It seemed to be, it was a surprising experience for Carol to hear her son describe this in such detail. The interesting thing is that after going through that experience, Chase was no longer frightened of loud noises. He came to terms with the reason for it happening. He knew it was a past life memory. It's nothing to do with this life, and he didn't have to worry anymore. And if we take it at face value that it was a past life memory, then maybe that sheds light on many other phobias that people have of snakes and spiders. Maybe in a past life they were bitten by a snake or a spider, or maybe it's just the survival instinct that brings those phobias up. I don't think we can easily categorize all phobias and fears as being past life memories, but it could be that that behavior, that unusual behavior as far as fears are concerned, could be a carryover from a traumatic experience in a past life.
Now, people that may be experiencing phobias from a past life, are they usually consciously aware that this phobia is from a past life? Let's say somebody was in the concentration camp during the Holocaust and was starved an awful lot. So in this life, they stock up a lot of food to make sure they always have plenty. Could they be doing this on a subconscious level and not know why they're doing it?
I've not come across a case like that, but it would make perfect sense. I think that it's one of those things that, unless it's explored, maybe under hypnosis to see, and certainly I know a few psychotherapists who deal with people with weight problems and have found causes in past life memories. Now, the important thing to say about psychotherapy, I'm a great advocate of its use in helping people come to terms with problems that they have, but I am critical of it in terms of the evidence that it provides for reincarnation. And even the therapists that use past life regression or hypnotic regression to try to help their patients, I would say at least 50% of them openly say that they have no idea whether the memories their patients have are real memories of a past life, or whether they are just a confabulation of the mind that helps the person subconsciously come to terms with a problem and rid themselves of it. And to the psychotherapist, and I guess to this patient as well, it doesn't actually matter whether it's real or not real, so long as it achieves the purpose of the therapy, and that is to overcome the problem and let them get on with this life, and get rid of the problem totally. From a reincarnation research point of view, that's why these cases are not too evidential. But they've achieved their aim, and that's all that matters. But I do quote in my book one particularly interesting case of a psychotherapist whose name was Linda Tarazi, who had a patient, and I believe a weight problem was her problem when she consulted Linda. She began recalling a life under the Spanish Inquisition, and it was so incredibly detailed, it took Linda 3 years of research and travel to other countries, looking up research books. Some books had not even been taken out of libraries and looked at for the last couple of decades or more to check the evidence, and she found it all tallied completely. So you can get good evidence under hypnosis, but generally that's not the purpose. And a therapist doesn't ask the right questions to get evidence for reincarnation. They don't say, what's the number on the door that you see, or what's the names of your children or your grandparents. What they say to the patient is, why are you feeling the way you do? Where's the cause of the problem you have? And that's what they're looking for, and trying to find a way of overcoming that. So that's why I separate the two and focus the evidence very much on spontaneous cases.
Okay, and that makes a lot of sense. Now, one of the other questions are actually the cases I was going to ask you to tell me about. Again, this one I found to be impressive, and I hope I pronounce it correctly, is Dada.
Right, yes. Well, during my visit to Lebanon, in fact, I made 2 visits to Lebanon to make a documentary. I went with a professor of anthropology on the first visit who was a skeptic, and the purpose of his involvement in the film was really to counter any leanings I might have had towards being a positive believer in reincarnation. I had explained to the producer of the documentary that I was pretty open-minded, and if I felt a case was evidential, I would say so, and if it wasn't, I would say not. But you know what television's like. Often you need 2 people to be arguing the toss about things, and that was fine by me. Unfortunately, the professor of anthropology, Roland Littlewood, had a stroke halfway through the filming and was rushed to the American hospital in Beirut, and we had to abandon the filming and return to England. And we went back with a different person within the year and started again from where we left off with a new co-presenter. But that gave me a very good opportunity to get to know the Druze community very well. And one of the people we were taken to see was a Dr. Abdel Abu Azi. Now, he was a general practitioner, he was a Druze, and so he was serving the Druze community in a village in the mountains, the Shuf Mountains, just above Beirut. And he was very open to reincarnation. He believed in reincarnation. He had no doubt about it. He hadn't gone into researching it, but he said that in many cases his patients would bring their children to him and say, you know, my child is always crying, this child is always unhappy, he's always fearful, maybe has phobias or whatever. We can't find out what's the problem. Could you examine him or her? And he said, often when I examined the child and gave the child a complete medical assessment, I could find nothing wrong at all. He said, but I would talk to the child and encourage the family to talk to the child and ask the child to talk about what was troubling them and why. And often in the course of doing that, the child would remember, talk about a past life they could remember, and he would encourage the family to explore that and go off and try to find the family. And he said that usually solved the problem. Now, the case you mentioned was an interesting one because a couple brought a little girl to him one day and said that their child was frightened of doctors normally and didn't like seeing doctors, but they'd been discussing doctors with somebody else, and Dr. Abu Aziz's name had been mentioned in conversation, and immediately she had jumped up and said, I want to see that doctor. And they said, but you don't like doctors. And she said, but I like this doctor, I want to see him. So they agreed to take her to see him the next time that she wasn't well. When they went into the consulting room and she saw that Dr. Abu Azi, the parents told him what she'd said, and he asked why she wanted to see him so much, and she said, because I used to see you when I was Dada. And he said, Dada, when were you Dada? And she gave more details about her life and what had happened, and she described how she had died by being shot. Now, apparently somebody had been out shooting goats and had either misfired or had seen the child moving in bushes and thought it was a goat. I don't know the details, but Dada had been shot, seriously injured, and had been rushed to hospital. And the moment she got there, they put an intravenous drip into her arm to try to bring life back into her body. She was fast dying, but it didn't succeed, and she died. Now, this little girl told Dr. Abu Azi exactly how she had died. She said, the lady in white was sticking a needle in my arm, and I don't remember anymore. She had described the circumstances of how she had died, and then the doctor said to her, well, why did you used to come and see me? And she said, I always had trouble here, and with that she pointed at her throat. Now, Dr. Abu Azi had identified immediately who she was talking about. He had had a patient in a previous life. He had a previous patient called Dada who had been shot exactly as this girl had described, and she had consulted him many times for throat problems. It was a recurring problem that she had. He even went and got her medical records and showed the girl's parents about this. And I believe that they possibly went and found the family of Dada. It's not a case I was able to follow up in detail because medical etiquette prevented him from actually naming the little girl in this life. She was a patient. She hadn't given permission. She might have done if we'd had time to explore it, but he said he had no doubt at all that she was the reincarnation of his previous patient, and she's really very happy, and she tells people that she's very lucky that she has the same doctor in this life that she had in her past life.
That's a very, fascinating story, and that's why I selected it for you, because that one and the theyve are the two that really stuck out the most, at least to me.
Uh-huh.
Now, I've heard that people can be male in one lifetime, female in another. And I don't mean to put you on the spot with this question, but, I'm dying of curiosity on this one. Do you think there may be a link between this and homosexuality in present life?
I think in some cases it certainly can be, and it was a subject that Professor Ian Stevenson, as a psychologist, examined quite closely, and he found in a number of cases that individuals, first of all, some of the cases he investigated were of a child remembering a life as a different sex. And he looked at the implications of that for the child in this life. It often manifested in a desire to wear the clothes of the opposite sex, or in behavior that reflected, if it was a little boy, it reflected the femininity of his previous life as a girl. Usually the child outgrew that, but it may have carried over as a deep-seated problem. It was something that Stevenson said he discovered in a couple of cases where individuals were so convinced that they were born in the wrong body and that they were really female, that they wanted to have a sex change operation, and I think they went through with it. Now, the thing about Stevenson was he was very against using hypnosis to explore past life, because, for the very reason I quoted before, that it is very suspect in terms of either the hypnotist may ask leading questions that produce the answers that the therapist is hoping for. And he didn't feel there was anything to gain from that. All he was doing with his examinations was to say we should be very open to the fact that individuals that claim to either have a sexual preference that is not what we regard as the norm may well be expressing something that is a carryover from a past life, in the same way as fears and phobias are, or in some cases skills. People, some reincarnation cases, an individual appears to remember at a very early age how to mend a car. I met a little boy in Lebanon who was an absolute whiz at repairing cars, and his parents told me that he could listen to a car engine and he knew exactly what was wrong and what was going wrong under the bonnet without even looking in, just from the sound. And that was not something that had been taught to him. It was just something he was born with. And it was sexual identity could well be a case that we have to accept that it's a bleed through.
It would make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. And it does raise what the biggest question it raises is, what sex is the soul? I mean, it's quite interesting until one sits down and thinks about it. You know, most people think even if you accept you're more than this flesh and bone, that you're a soul. If you're a man, you think, oh, I'm a man's soul, and my wife is a woman's soul. But, you know, we're thinking in physical terms because we are living in bodies anatomically that are different. But maybe our souls are asexual, that they are neither male nor female, that they adjust to the body into which you are born, and they need to, obviously, for procreation, etc. But maybe it doesn't always manifest purely, and then you get these, I hesitate to say aberrations, but departures from the norm, and so people have different...
Or what would be considered the norm, not necessarily that's a departure from the norm.
Exactly, yeah. And that's an interesting thing about reincarnation study. I think it opens people's minds to a whole lot of other possibilities in terms of who we are and what we are as individuals, and not to be too black and white about it.
Okay. Yeah, and I asked that because I've heard people before say, I'm in the wrong body. I was born to be a woman, or I was born to be a man, and God put me in the wrong body. It's a big debate in churches and other places that I've been to, in fact. And, I thought, it makes sense if this is what's going on. And like you say, what if the soul's genderless? What if it gets into a body and then it gets attached to a body, and that's why it gets confused in the next life, because it still had an attachment that it acquired in a past life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting things, these research statistics throw up some fascinating statistics, and one is that the majority of cases of children remembering past lives are of males remembering a past life. So there's more boys than girls remembering past lives. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And they usually are remembering lives, previous lives as males. So these sex change or sex swap cases are certainly in the minority. And looking for an explanation for this, and this is pure hypothesis, one suggestion is that the other statistic often quoted in these cases is that something like 50% of all cases of children remembering past lives involve a violent end to that previous existence. They're either murdered or were run down by a car or a train or had some other awful end to their lives. And so maybe the reason violence in some form features prominently in those cases that are remembered is because it was such a traumatic ending to that life that it has carried into this life at a young age as a very strong memory that really overshadows everything else that's happening to them in their new life. And that does make some sense, and it would maybe suggest that, and I don't know whether there are statistics that would support this argument, that more males have violent ends to their lives than females. Perhaps because they are soldiers and they get shot, or they work in dangerous jobs where they're more likely to be killed, like a miner down a mine or something, where women are not exposed to those sort of dangers. And so that would explain why a majority are male. These are all hypotheses, but they, sometimes you've got these statistics and we have to try and make sense of them and understand what they're telling us. And that's, I throw them out for anyone that's listening to think about and make their own decisions.
Right. And, the thing about hypothesis, though, is they give you something to study. And as long as you got something to study, you got something to do and to entertain you. At least that's my view.
Absolutely.
In your book, you also talk about the brain storing the memory and say there's good reason to believe this. But is it possible that there's another storage science is either not aware of or does not accept such as the Akashic records mentioned by Edgar Casey?
I think it's a very important question because, first of all, if we believe in reincarnation and memories carried over from one life to the next, or even if we just believe in spirit communication through mediums, where the dead are able to speak to the living via mediums, that implies that the memory does not get stored in the brain, and it has to be, it has to survive death and be stored somewhere else. Now that's very difficult for scientists to accept, of course, and the scientists and skeptics usually say no. The brain is what produces and stores memories, and when the brain dies, the memories die, and that's the end of it. So that's why there cannot be a soul continuing beyond death. All I would say to that is that that doesn't explain why the memories that children have are so strong and detailed and emotion-ridden if they're not identifying with something. They are also very detailed to the extent of being remarkably intimate at times. There's a famous case of Shanti Devi that I quote. It's one of the very earliest cases that was investigated in India, where a little girl was taken by a committee, and this was at the time when Mahatma Gandhi was alive, and he took a great interest in the case, and a committee of professors and others was formed, and they took the girl to the village where she claimed to remember living, and sure enough, she was able to take them to the house she lived in and to the family and everything else. So it's a detailed case. I won't go into the detail now. But one of the interesting things was that she was introduced to her husband in a past life. And she told him, she said she wanted to speak to him privately. And they allowed her to just sit alone with her husband. And he confided later in a researcher called Dr. Kirti Rawat, who I interviewed a couple of times, once in Nepal when I was visiting and once in India, where he now resides. And he told me that the past life husband said that he wasn't satisfied that Shanti Devi was his past life wife until she told him about their lovemaking. Now, she had been seriously crippled with arthritis, and because of that, her lovemaking with him had to be performed in a certain way because of the pain and everything else of her body. And he said nobody but Shanti Devi knew that, and this little girl knew this in detail and told me exactly what we did and how we did it. Now, okay, where did that memory come from? If that little girl wasn't the reincarnation of Shanti Devi, then did she have access to that memory, that intimate memory from somewhere else, like the Akashic records? And if so, why was she only able to access the Akashic records relating to this one person? Why is a child's reincarnation memories always focused on one individual? It's not having a key to the Akashic records so they can look up anybody and talk about anybody in detail. It's always related only to one individual. So that's one point I'd like to make. The other thing is that we have seen some interesting research done with memory that suggests that memory may not reside only in the brain. And recent transplant cases have shown that some individuals who have had a heart or lungs transplanted from somebody who has been who's died or been killed in an accident and has donated their organs, that recipient of those organs sometimes, once they've recovered, find that they have unusual tastes or interests, that their personality has changed to an extent, even to actually using words that they never used before. And research has shown that when this has been investigated, it's found that the donor had exactly those feelings. So the suggestion here is that somehow just parts of the body being donated, that the organs somehow carry a memory with them as well. Now, this needs to be investigated a lot more, but these cases have been written up and are quite fascinating, and I think a lot more research needs to be done on that. And lastly, there's some research done with worms, of all things, and worms, if you chop off the head of a worm, you may know, and a lot of people know, it won't die, it will just grow a new head and a new tail and become two worms. But the interesting thing is that they've been able to train worms in certain ways, and I'm not sure what the training involves, but that it will know where to look or where to go for certain foods. And they've discovered that if you cut up a worm that has a head and a tail, and then the tail end, where theoretically there's no memory, then grows a new head, and you put it in the environment where it was trained, it will still go to what it was trained to do. It will find whatever it has to look for. And I've given this evidence in the book. Again, it's early days on that research, but it suggests that certainly even in creatures like worms, that memory may not only be in the head and the brain, but somehow throughout the whole body. And maybe that indicates the memory is not in the body at all, but is in some energy field that goes, that belongs and animates the body, and on death that continues and survives with the memories, and then can return and be reborn or go on to another dimension and carry on in that new life.
I got to tell you, I was totally unaware until you that research is being done, and I think it's utterly fascinating. I really do. And, I think it says a whole lot, and I think it shows that we're growing and learning still as well.
Absolutely.
Now, are there other explanations for reincarnation besides living more than once? I mean, things that could be mistaken for reincarnation, for example?
There are. The most obvious one, I guess, are just people who have psychological problems and have ideas of grandiose and want to believe that they are someone famous, for example, that maybe live rather mundane and boring lives and dream up. I used to do quite a few television programs, studio debates in the UK here, in which a lady who believed she was Queen Elizabeth I would take part by invitation because she was such a colourful character, and she would always come dressed in the part in a long gown and a tiara, but really she produced no evidence to prove that she was who she said she was, but she was a lot of fun to have on a talk show. So there are those sort of cases. But I prefer to focus on the evidence for rather than the cases against. And I'd like to talk about the physical evidence that we have to bear with. Now we've talked about memories, and memories are always the strong point when a child can remember in detail and name villages and families, etc. What is more difficult for the skeptics to explain, however, is when that child also has birthmarks or birth defects which coincide with that life they remember. Now, I had read a few cases about this in my early study and thought they were exceptional, fascinating but exceptional. But Professor Ian Stevenson began to notice that this was a lot more common in the cases he was studying than had previously been assumed. And he published in the end of the 1990s a 2-volume study called Reincarnation and Biology, which examined in enormous detail a huge number of cases where the subjects manifested some sort of mark that had a bearing on the past life they were remembering. Now, in some of these cases, the birth defect was very, very unusual, even to the extent of being unique. I mean, apparently, birthmarks, until I started reading about this, I didn't realize that most people are born with birthmarks. There might be little moles or something of like that nature, but generally they are not very important. People like Gorbachev has those big, like a red stain on their body, but generally, medical science doesn't understand why they occur or what their reason is. And Stevenson began to realize that possibly an event in a past life may be responsible for some of them. So, for example, his book includes illustrations of a little girl who was born with one normal leg and another leg which looked as if it had restrictions, like a rope tied around the leg and been bound. So the leg actually keeps going in and out, like it had been squeezed in certain places. And she remembered very clearly a death which was confirmed that the person she remembered existed and all the details fitted, who had in fact been tied up and buried in a well. In that case, I think she was a man in a previous life, and that's how the body was found, with these ties around the body. Another girl was born with a missing leg from below the knee joint. So her body was absolutely perfect, but from below the knee, no leg. And that's a really unusual birth defect. You won't find many of those on record, if any. And she remembered being run over by a train. She gave all the details. It was all confirmed. And the train severed her leg. It also injured other parts of her body, but the leg was severed by the train. So, these cases occur with more frequency than we would have expected. But the biggest number relate to bullet wounds. I guess the most common cause of some violent deaths is being shot through the head. And Stevenson discovered that what happens in those cases is that he first of all began by looking at ordinary post-mortem cases in the USA, just of people that have been shot through the head, to familiarize himself with the sort of damage that a bullet wound does. And if you are unfortunate enough to be shot through the head, then obviously you have a bullet point that is the entry point, which is usually quite a small hole because the bullet is moving at such speed. And then as it passes through the brain, it slows down, and by the time it shoots out of the other side of the head, it does more damage because it's moving at a slower speed. Now, what Stevenson began to observe in these cases was that invariably there were two birthmarks coincided with those wounds from the previous life. In many cases, he was able to get post-mortem reports, and even the size of the birthmarks on the child recording that death coincided in size with the point of entry and exit of a bullet. And one of the most fascinating cases, I can just tell you quickly about that, was a man called, a boy called Nazi Aldanaf, who could remember being, let me make sure I've got my details here. Yes, filed. No, I'm talking about the different case. Bear with me a second. I'm going to pull up my notes. It's Camille, a little boy whose name, he was given the name Daham by his family, and his surname was Farici, and this was in Turkey. And from the moment he could talk, when the family called him Daham, he said, "Don't call me Daham, my name is Camille. I am Camille." And he gave his name, and he said his name was Camille Hayek. Now, to cut a long story short, Camille Hayek was, in fact, quite a well-known bandit many years before, who had shot two men because he had decided they were responsible for raping his two sisters. And as a result of that, murdering them, he went on the run with his brother. He went into hiding, and the only way they could survive was basically by robbing travelers in an isolated region of Turkey to give them enough to live on. And but the police were eventually, 2 years after he was on the run, they found out where he was hiding. The brothers were hiding, and they surrounded the house, and they demanded that they come out. They refused to give themselves up, and Camille Hayek, rather than be caught by the police and whatever the consequences would have been, he turned his gun on his brother and shot him dead, and then he put the rifle under his chin and used his toe to pull the trigger and shot himself through the head. Now, that was remembered quite clearly by this little boy, Camille Farici, who told the detail. And what's really fascinating about this particular case is that when he was born, he had a wound under his chin that was bleeding, and the family had to take him to the hospital, and he had to have stitches in it. And so that left a scar under his chin. Now, when Professor Stevenson heard about this case many years later, he got to meet Camille, who was now an adult, and he asked him if he could look at the birthmark under the chin, which was clearly there. He took photographs of it. Camille, as a swarthy Turkish adult, had a very strong beard, yet there was this pigmented area where no hairs had grown under his chin, which coincided with the bullet wound going in. And later on, Stevenson thought to himself, nobody, and he spoke to many witnesses about the case, about when the boy was young and what had happened, nobody's ever mentioned any other birthmark, but according to the cases I've investigated, Camille ought to have a wound on top of his head where the bullet would have exited. So he went back to see Camille and just said to him, it wasn't a leading question, he said, we've talked about the birthmark under your chin. Do you have any other birthmarks? You've not mentioned any. Do you have any others? And he said, yes, I do. I've got one on top of my head. And sure enough, Stevenson pulled back the hair on top of his head, and there was a larger pigmented area exactly where you would expect to find the bullet exit point. So, and that, incidentally, one of Camille Hayek's sisters identified his body and saw him soon after he had been shot, and had described the wounds on his body exactly where they now appear on the body of Camille Parigi. So these are the sort of cases that the skeptics need to confront and offer some good alternative. And it underlines that memories alone are not what we're dealing with. It's something far more than that.
Right. And one of the interesting things you mentioned is that the wound on top of the head was larger than the one where the bullet entered, or where the wound on the chin is, because it's been my knowledge, according to what I was taught in boot camp, that bullet wounds coming out are bigger than the bullet wounds going in.
That's absolutely right, because the bullet is now then moving at a slower speed and does more damage. That's my understanding.
Okay. Now, you actually got to my next question when you started in about the birthmarks.
Mm-hmm. That's because I'm psychic.
Yeah, there you got it. And actually, I was also going to ask you, what do you think is good evidence for reincarnation? But you pretty well got that one covered too, as well. So, now would be a good time for me to ask you about anything that I may not have thought to cover that you would like to get out there.
First of all, I think I'd just like to talk about another case that I'm very familiar with. It happened in England. It was a case where I was involved on a number of television shows with the people involved, and it shows how important it is for some individuals to find their past life families. I think I always say to people often say to me, rather, I'd like to know who I was in a past life. I'd love to find out more about my past life. And I say to them, why do you want to? Because surely this is your life now. Whatever you did before is immaterial. Focus on this life. That's why you're here now. Enjoy it. Do what you can to help others, and get on with it, and don't worry too much about your past lives. But for the children I've spoken about with these very strong memories, that sort of response wouldn't be acceptable. They come with a very strong urge to be reunited with that past life family. And a case that I'm talking about involved a lady called Jenny Cacao, and she was an English woman who remembered from an early age being a woman called Mary Sutton. And Mary Sutton, she knew, was an Irish woman, and she knew she had died in childbirth, and she knew she had many children, that her husband was an alcoholic, and she knew that when she died in childbirth, her children could not have been brought up by her husband. He was incapable of doing it, and they would have been separated and divided and probably sent off to foster homes. And she had this urge, as a teenager, she really felt she wanted to reunite her family, bring them back together again. She felt that was her mission in life, if you like. She was able to draw a map of the village in which she felt she lived. She knew exactly where the church was and where the house was and other details. And then she got a map of Ireland, and she felt drawn to a little village called Malahide, which was just outside Dublin. And again, to cut a long story short, she did her own research. She contacted a priest in Dublin who was able to eventually, from the clues she gave, she could remember most of the names of the children. He was able to confirm that they did exist. I think he might have even had to have put a newspaper ad in the papers to find them. But basically, the fascinating story is that she went back to Ireland with a television crew. A researcher had checked out some of her facts beforehand, and she was able to meet her children from that past life. And I got to meet and know very well her son from that past life called Sonny. And he told me that when he first met Jenny Cacao, he felt she didn't look like his mother, but he could see his mother in her eyes, if that makes any sense. But the eyes being the window of the soul, if you like, he could see his mother there. But he said, she and I had a long chat, and she told me things that nobody else but my mother and I knew about those early days of my life. And so he was totally convinced that Jenny Cacao was his mother. And what was really amazing was that these children had been put out to foster homes, and most of them had been brought up and had gone into adulthood and were totally unaware that they were living just streets away from their brothers and sisters. And what Jenny Cacao did was to bring them all back together again for the first time. So I mention that because it's an urge that people have sometimes, and I think we have to be very open to listening to what people say about past lives and memories, and encourage them to speak about it when they have those feelings. But I think the most important message I've got from reincarnation is if it happens to all of us, and I'm not prepared to say that on the basis of the evidence only that it happens to some people, but whoever it happens to, if it is a possibility that you and I could be reborn, then maybe it's a good reason for taking a lot more care of this planet and what we're doing to it, and the legacy we're leaving to future generations, because we might be those future generations.
Right, and you wouldn't want to be your grandson's son in a future life either if you didn't raise your son so well and he didn't raise his son so well.
Absolutely. Or if we've run out of food or water or everything else because we've been too greedy or too focused on getting through this life and thinking it's not our problem, it won't be our problem, let someone else worry about that, because we might be the ones that are inheriting it.
Yeah, very well could be, as in a future lifetime we're totally unaware of it. Most people, a lot of people here in the Western world is what I'm, I guess, getting at. By the percentages, the bigger amount, I would think. They go with the church doctrine, you either go to heaven or hell. The danger behind this doctrine is a lot of people are like, well, who cares about the world we're in now? It's just going to be here now. If they find out that their belief system was wrong, and they end up later on and they have a past memory, well, you got somebody with some regrets.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, for me, it seemed like a safe way to play it would be take care of your planet, be responsible parents. You're taking care of what God wants you to, no matter what's true or what's false.
Mm-hmm.
Just
Absolutely.
do the right thing, period, no matter what you believe, in other words.
Absolutely. Yep, I agree 100%. And, and focus on making the most of this life for yourself and everybody around you. And if you do that, maybe you won't need to come back. And if you don't do that, then maybe you do come back and it turns out to be hell after all, because you didn't take care of the planet when you had the opportunity to do so.
Exactly. Now, do you have any last-minute thoughts for everybody?
No, I think that pretty well sums up my view. As I say, I'm not trying to convince anybody or not trying to tell anybody that they have to believe in reincarnation. My book is very much about presenting the evidence, but I think that evidence is so riveting. The stories themselves could be movie scripts in many of the cases, the intricate relationships that happen. And basically a lot of this evidence that I've collected from parapsychological journals, scientific journals, it's all been really shut off from the outside world. It's been there for anyone that's willing to look for it. And I really feel the need to make it more public and make more people aware, so that perhaps we'll have fewer people dismissing reincarnation as just a load of nonsense. Because when you realize how much there is out there in the way of good evidence, then I think it opens the mind to so many possibilities. So hopefully I will have achieved that aim with this book, and it will achieve that.
Well, I think it probably will. I mean, like I say, I've read the book myself, and one of the things I would say to people is I would personally recommend the book, because it's one of the most best-rounded books on reincarnation that I think I've read in my time altogether. I mean, I've read, people, their views on the afterlife, from different books. I've read The Voice, What the Bible Has to Say About Reincarnation, which is geared right at that one topic. I've read books that were about people that had a reincarnation experience, but I've seen very few. This is the only one I've actually read. I'm sure there's others out there that actually goes in and covers about talking in tongues and its possibility of different language, in a past life, the birthmarks and how they could be, behaviors in there. It's got so much different things to think about, so much food for thought, that it's a great thing to have around. It's a great thing to have for discussions about reincarnation. If you have meetings about it, or you have company over that ask if you know about it, or whatever the case may be, I think it's a handy piece to have around.
That's good news. I'm glad you enjoy this.
Okay. Now, I'm going to go ahead and call the show a wrap, but before I do, I got one last final question for you. Are you going to be writing any more books that's of a paranormal genre in the near future?
I have some ideas that I want to explore, but I'm talking to two different publishers about them, and it's whichever one gives me the nod first will be the one that I focus on. So I'm not able to tell you which it is, because I haven't been given the nod on those yet. But I've written about 10 books on different aspects of the paranormal over the years, and that includes UFOs, Atlantis, spirit communication, healers and healing. So it's a pretty wide-ranging field of interest that I have. But reincarnation and the afterlife are the main topics, so it will almost certainly be related to that field.
Okay, well, the reason I ask is I was going to say it'd be nice to have you back when you have your next book out.
Well, that's really kind. I appreciate that. It's probably going to take a good year or two to produce another book, depending on. I've got a huge database of information, but
right.
Once I've got approval for the concept, then I will certainly need to do a bit of new research to make sure I'm ahead of the game, if you like. But Roy, I've enjoyed chatting and appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Big Book of Reincarnation, and certainly would be happy to come back when I've got another book under my belt, as it were.
Okay, Doug. Well, I'm going to let you go with that. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. As the old saying goes, don't do anything I wouldn't do if you could find such a thing.
Well, that leaves it wide open as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it does. And I'll hope to stay in touch with you. I've got your information and you've got mine. Feel free to contact me anytime you want. And I look forward to having you back, and it's been a fantastic interview. Thank you very much. Oh, okay. And I'll be sending you some links, by the way, to where the show is archived. Once I get it up, it's going to take me a day or two.
That's great. Well, I really appreciate it, and thank you again.
Okay, thank you. You have a good one.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, everybody. Just making sure that and everything appears to still be on. I didn't accidentally cut off the wrong thing. Real quick, I want to remind everybody to come back and see me Tuesday night at 8 p.m. My guest will be Neil Kramer, and we'll be talking about his new book, The Unfoldment. And also, don't forget to visit my friends over at World UFO Today and learn a little bit more about UFO Day, and maybe you can help them get the word out that they're actually hosting this event. That way you have a whole year to look into it and to get, do whatever you'd like to do with it. And also, if you look in the menu on the left, down toward the end of it, you'll see other category, and right underneath other, you'll see a link that says Friends. If you click on that, I've got some banners over here. Now, the very top one has been closed down, and I probably ought to remove it. I just keep hoping the guy will be able to get his site back up, so I'm trying to stall. But underneath that, you got Supernatural UFO, which is a UFO forum, which actually covers a lot of paranormal topics, not just UFOs. Then underneath that, you've got United Paranormal International. These are both great places. I'd be more than happy to recommend them to anybody. And then, if you look down this under that, 2 more links, you'll see radio favorites. I got a list of links, banners, to different radio shows that hosts that I know and I recommend. UKPN Radio with Gary Brown. JimHarold.com. He's got his own radio show. He's been on my show, and he's a fantastic guest and a great host. Actually, so was Gary. And the next one as well, Micah Hanks of the Gralien Report. And I haven't really had Mark Snyder on. However, he's been one of the long-standing hosts over at Blog Talk Radio with Ohio Exopolitics Radio. And although I haven't had him on my show, I've been to his show, and he does a really good job, in my opinion. So I'd recommend any of these folks if y'all are interested in hearing other radio shows besides just mine. And I want to thank you guys for coming. I couldn't have a show without my guests any more than I could without my listeners. Thank everybody who's listening to me at YouTube and Dailymotion and Media Cafe, and even in my archives here at www.paranormalpalace.com. Don't forget you can visit my guest at www.paranormalreview.com. And I'll be looking forward to seeing you guys on Tuesday. Y'all have a good one, and I'm going to call this one a wrap.
More in the Hindu religion, they do make a distinction, but I must say that for most people in the West, the terms are interchangeable, and I confess that I use rebirth sometimes instead of reincarnation because it's a shorter word. But I think in the Hindu religion, they talk of rebirth for humans, but reincarnation for gods. Or it may be the other way around, but that's their distinction. But to me, there's not, it means much the same. It means whichever term you use, it means returning to earth and being born again. Except with Hindus, they're talking about gods and therefore not being born on earth, but being reborn as gods.
Okay. I can see why they would make that distinction. Now, for the purposes of this show, because when I type these questions, I put down, like ever endorsed reincarnation or rebirth. I think it's easier just to say reincarnation, which is what I'm used to, so I won't be using both like I typed it on the question sheet here I made up. But one of the things I was going to ask you, and I kind of briefly touched with this on the telephone while we was waiting for the show to start, and I really only have that I can see, unless they're further down and I haven't scrolled to them yet, maybe three questions along this here vein, and none of them deal with at least what I would call too much speculation. And I just thought if you could give me as brief an answer, or as the kind of answer you're able to give, because I realize there may be limitations here. I'd appreciate it. Did any of the 3 Abrahamic faiths believe in reincarnation, to your knowledge?
The answer to that is that Judaism, aspects of it do believe in reincarnation. In fact, I've had an interesting chat with a Rabbi Gershom, who did a lot of research with cases of people that claim to remember having been Jews during the period of the Holocaust, but had been reborn outside of the Jewish religion, and they attributed that to the fact that they were so horrified at the treatment they had as Jews that they just wanted to return to Earth in a different culture and with a different appearance, so that they didn't experience that again. He wrote a book called Beyond the Ashes, which is a fascinating book, and for his particular aspect of Judaism, reincarnation is a very, very important teaching. The Kabbalah teachings are also
Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello everyone, welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and joining me today is Roy Stemman, and that might be Stemman, and I may be pronouncing it wrong, and if I am, I apologize. And he's got a book out called The Big Book of Reincarnation. I've read this book personally, and it is chock full of information about reincarnation from many different perspectives, and some of them I don't think many of the researchers have thought about, much less investigated as well as he has. And some of the actual past life experiencers that he's actually been in contact with have had some very interesting cases. Pardon that little bit of a cough there, folks. I'll try not to do that on the air, but, down here we've been having a lot of rain, and all the moisture in the air kind of gets in your throat and gets you kind of crouped up. So if I do slip in here and there, just kind of overlook me. Roy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Royce. Thank you very much.
Okay. Real quick, before we get involved in this, I want to tell everybody they can learn more about you and your book at www.paranormalreview.com. If you'll have any questions, you can call in at, I lost my number. It's right here on the page in front. Here it is. I had to scroll up, not down. The number to call in is 832-632-7904. If you're listening at YouTube or somewhere else, to join the show live, get into chat. The membership here is free. It's www.paranormalpalace.com. Pardon me. Roy, real quick, why don't you tell everybody here, just kind of break the ice and they help them know you a little bit better. What got you involved in reincarnation in particular?
Well, that goes back to my teenage years. I first became interested in the big question, what happens when we die? For the reason that I came across a book by Air Chief Marshal Lord Dowding, who was the person who led the Battle of Britain during World War II for Britain, and he's a British hero, understandably. And I was very surprised to read in the book that during the Second World War, he, as well as playing the role that he did, he was also attending seances and receiving messages from dead soldiers and airmen and passing them on to family members. They were actually giving him contact details of where they could find their loved ones, and he passed them on. So that opened my mind to the possibility of communication with, it's something one has to examine and dismiss or accept depending on the evidence for it. Other possibilities are simply that a child has obtained that information from other sources, overhearing things, etc. So all these alternative explanations have to be looked at, and only when they have all been discarded are we ready to entertain the thought that these individuals really are remembering a life they have lived previously on Earth.
Okay. And I think it's good that you do that. I have a lot more confidence when I read an author's book and they're giving you the whole picture and both sides, because there's an author that's giving you a big picture to look at. They're not just saying, look at my belief. In other words, look at my agenda. Anybody could do that, and there are some who do. So when somebody does like you do, I'm like, well, I got more confidence in this person. You see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Well, I have no vested interest in making people believe in reincarnation. In fact, occasionally people say to me, oh, you just like the idea of reincarnation because it's an attractive idea, etc. And I always counter that with the statement, well, actually, I don't think it's a very attractive idea. I'm not sure that I would want to reincarnate. Maybe I'll come back in my next life in a situation that is not one that I really appreciate. I mean, I'm really enjoying my life now, and it's been a great life so far, and I hope it's got plenty more things, to look forward to. But if we accept reincarnation as being something that happens to us all on a regular basis, then we've got to accept the possibility that part of the reason for reincarnating is to expand our experience or give us more experiences, and that must include good and bad experiences. So it's not necessarily an attractive belief, but all I'm saying in my book is that here are some really strong cases. Take a look at them. Decide for yourself whether you think this evidence is proof of reincarnation, and if so, draw your own the implications from that.
Right.
But I'm not saying that I believe that everybody reincarnates. All I'm saying is that the very good cases I'm presenting appear to be proof, and maybe that indicates we do all reincarnate.
Okay. Now, one of the things that you made a distinction about in your book that I thought would be a good idea to clarify for all the listeners here is the distinction between rebirth and reincarnation. Can you elaborate on that for the listeners?
Well, that's very much in favor of reincarnation, but others are not so. So the answer is, as happens with lots of religions, there are offshoots. In fact, I mentioned earlier the Druze that I'd been to visit with a TV team to do a documentary. Reincarnation is so important to them, and yet they are an offshoot of Islam, and Islam does not teach reincarnation. So when you begin to examine religious belief and the differences in views over the centuries, it's quite fascinating to see how religions evolve and change their views of the afterlife and what may happen to us. And there's even an argument that the early Christians believed very strongly in reincarnation, but it was made anathema, which was wiped out of their beliefs at a meeting in Constantinople, and it's all in my book about how that happened. And so the Christian teachings no longer talk about reincarnation or rebirth. And yet, interestingly, if you look at current opinion polls in the West, both in the United States and the United Kingdom, you'll find that something like 20% of Christians who are asked whether they believe in reincarnation or not will give a positive answer, either that they accept it totally or that they are open to the possibility. So even what's happening these days is that religious beliefs are getting quite mixed up, and people are making up their own minds about these important subjects and not being too rigid in their outlook just because of the teachings of the church that they belong to.
Right. Well, you kind of sort of answered my next question, because I was going to ask, what evidence have you found, if any, that Christianity ever endorsed reincarnation? And I think I just heard you cover that with the early church and it being wiped out at Constantinople. However, the next question behind that, and that's the last one that deals with religion, is a little bit more specific, because I know that many of the early Christian sects like Gnosticism, Catholicism, and, some of the others of the day, in other words, did in fact teach reincarnation, and it was a part of their doctrine. However, more specifically, and I'm not sure, but I'm kind of thinking your answer about Constantinople, since that was really held for the Catholic Church. You're saying that your book is covering that the Catholic Church itself, at one point in its very early roots, did have a doctrine on reincarnation?
The dead, and I became subsequently very involved in the spiritualist movement and wrote for a spiritualist newspaper called Psychic News for 8 years, and became assistant editor of the newspaper. But one of the things that always puzzled me about spiritualism's belief about the afterlife was a contradiction relating to reincarnation. Some mediums and their spirit guides believed very much in reincarnation, and others dismissed it as impossible and argued that our spiritual development after this life was always to be found in other dimensions, in an afterlife, if you like. And I was really puzzled as to why they couldn't agree. Even the spirits communicating couldn't agree about reincarnation. And I always liked a good mystery and a good challenge, and I decided to try and come up with the answers myself by looking at the evidence. After all, belief in something is fine, but if it's not based on evidence, then sometimes you're on shaky ground. So that's how I began collecting evidence, exploring the subject, reading up about it, meeting the researchers, and ultimately I did a TV documentary which took me to the Lebanon and the Druze community, where I met many individuals who could remember past lives, and I've also met people remembering past lives in the United States and in the UK and in other parts of Europe. So putting it all together, I came to the conclusion that the evidence for reincarnation is very strong, and I put that evidence in the book, but I've also dealt with the alternative theories and explanations that we also have to examine very closely before we come to any firm opinion on this.
Matter of fact, didn't you devote a chapter, entire chapter to the alternatives?
Yes, I did. Absolutely. And in fact, any researcher working in this field, first of all, when they come across a case, it's the alternative theories they need to address first, and they do. And the alternative theories include fraud, particularly in some of the underdeveloped countries. One could argue that some very poor families have encouraged their children to remember a past life of having lived with a wealthy family, for example, in the hopes that by having a reunion, if you like, or an introduction to that family, and convincing them that their child is the reincarnation of somebody important in that wealthy family, that they might benefit financially, obviously. There's very little evidence that ever happens, but